welcome to this Radix webinar on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I first met John in Northern Ireland when both of us had a little less grey hair, but he was, I was visiting with Richard Home, who was then the Northern Ireland spokesperson, and John, you gave what I still regard as the best leader's speech as leader of the Alliance that I have ever heard. You claimed without a word of notes. I choose to believe you. It was superb. So I'm really delighted that you're here. I'm going to hand over to co-founder of Radix and to Joe Zammit-Lucia, who's going to be chairing in a moment. Meantime, can I just remind you, at any stage, you can use the chat function.
At some point, yes. No.
You can use the chat function to put in a comment. As is being demonstrated for us by someone, please make certain that you're on mute at all times. And Joe, will you remind us the rules? I think we're on the record today, so you run that risk. And thank you very much. Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Welcome, everybody. Just to remind you what Ben has just said, if you could turn off your video feeds and mute yourselves, that would be helpful. This is being recorded, so the way we'll do it is we'll have a conversation with John and Jonathan, and if you would post any questions or comments that you have during that period on the chat, then we'll bring you in after we've had an initial conversation, if that's okay. So just to kick off, the Northern Ireland Protocol has been, I guess, in the news these past several months, and with temperatures rising on all sides, it seems, although it seems to have calmed down a little bit now. The question is there a solution to the Northern Ireland problem, given that Brexit has happened? Getting back, I'm going to introduce our two very distinguished speakers. Lord Alderdice, who was Speaker and a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly for East Belfast until 2004, and then until 2003. He was also a leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland from 1978 to 1998, and now sits in the House of Lords as a Liberal Democrat. So John has experienced, Northern Ireland from the inside, as it were. Jonathan was Chief of Staff under Prime Minister Tony Blair, and I guess experienced Northern Ireland as the lead negotiator leading up to the Good Friday Agreement and all the difficulties and challenges that involved. Both John and Jonathan now help in mediation processes around the world. So hopefully they can give us some insights both on Northern Ireland as it is and where we might go from here. I'll start by handing over to John to give us his views on the current situation and hopes for the future. John.
Joe, Ben, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to participate. And of course, it's always a particular pleasure to share a platform, virtual or otherwise, with Jonathan. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement is almost a quarter of a century old now. On its 20th anniversary, Chris Patten, now Lord Patten of Barnes, one of the most respected members of the House, in a debate in the House of Lords, described the Good Friday Agreement as one of the biggest achievements in post-war British politics, without any question at all. And he was someone who had experienced many important developments in Northern Ireland, of course, but in many other places too. So what was the achievement of the Belfast Agreement, and why does it run into difficulties with this protocol? Well, we had tried many of the traditional ways of reaching an accommodation in Northern Ireland over quite a long time. One of the traditional pieces of wisdom was that you could never get agreement with the extremists, so you had to exclude them and negotiate amongst the more moderate people, unionist, nationalist, and in the centre ground, and reach an agreement which would then marginalise extremism. Well, all very interesting and reasonable. The only problem with it was it didn't work, and it was tried repeatedly. Then eventually we turned it on its head. And whenever those who were, if you like, the more extreme people came in, and let's not forget, there was never a time when everybody was around the same table at the same time, but nevertheless, an agreement was achieved. But there was something more important even than this technical question of who should be involved. And that was the appreciation that what we were dealing with was disturbed historic relationships between communities of people. It wasn't all about policing or borders. It wasn't all about constitutions and institutions. It wasn't even about human rights and socioeconomic development. It was about disturbed historic relationships between communities of people that had gone on for hundreds of years. And so the whole business was to try to find a way of enabling people to get together and work with those disturbed relationships. It wasn't, in a sense, about reaching agreement so much as finding a way of disagreeing without killing each other. So some of the questions which you've thoughtfully set down for us in looking at the protocol, are there any lasting solutions possible given the many different and conflicting interests in Northern Ireland? Is a negotiated settlement likely to be lasting, temporary, or a festering sore? Can all the sides of the debate find political imagination? When you begin to say, okay, let's put the word relationships in there and see if it makes sense. So are there any lasting solutions possible to any set of relationships? Well, if you think that you've got a relationship that is sorted, it's already in trouble, let me tell you. And you don't need to be a psychiatrist to know that. When we say, is any negotiated settlement likely to be lasting or temporary? Well, let's say, is any arrangement for relationships within these islands likely to be lasting or temporary? Well, all of them are temporary. We used to joke in Northern Ireland that everything was temporary, though the provisionals were permanent. So, of course, the point is that relationships develop and grow and modify and change. And if you try to institutionalize those so much that they are rigid and regulated, then you will inevitably run into trouble. So when this huge shock to the system emerged, Brexit, and we'll not go into the whole question of Brexit and what it involved, but when that happened, the point is it changed the relationships. And if it was going to be able to resolve and address and maintain the issues which we had been struggling with, then those relationships needed to reflect that. And here we ran into problems, because the three sets of relationships and the three strands of the talks led to three interlocking sets of institutions, which needed to be maintained as relationships, not merely institutions. And what happened after a relatively short time was the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference just stopped meeting at a senior level. British government wasn't meeting with the Irish government at the top level, vice versa. And neither of them were really addressing it. They sort of said to themselves, oh, it doesn't matter. We're not the problem. The problem is these fellows and girls in Northern Ireland that can't live together, but we're not a problem. Well, of course, it was a problem. And it was a particular problem when Brexit arrived, because at that point, there was no longer the kind of relationship between the British Prime Minister and the Irish Taoiseach that there had been right through the period from John Major and Albert Reynolds through to the agreement and to the beginnings of the implementation of the agreement. And there was no remembering by the next generation of Northern Ireland politicians, or indeed British and Irish politicians, of what we had to do to enable the process to develop and move forward and bring us a relatively peaceful outcome. Had there been that set of relationships, then in advance of the question of Brexit, there would have been serious conversations between the two governments about the implications of all of this, and much more serious conversations north, south, and east, west. But of course, what happened was the Irish government found itself falling back, not acting as a bridge between Britain and the European Union, but acting as a bulwark for the European institutions against Britain. It was the kind of bad, difficult, or unhappy relationship that you get in a divorce, which of course to some extent this was. Now, what's the importance of this? It's not about rehearsing old problems, because it's about trying to find a way forward in all of this. And what we learn from it, I think, is that if we simply turn to structures and institutions and laws and regulations, we won't resolve the protocol problem, or rather the problem the protocol was put in place to resolve. We've got to understand that this is about relationships on these islands and with the wider Europe. There was an understanding of that after the Second World War, when European leaders came together to develop the European project. But sadly, that project itself has to some extent deteriorated into legislation and regulation, rather than an understanding that we have to find a way of understanding and working with each other. In fact, I often say to colleagues, if the people that have been in the negotiations over the last little while on the protocol had been in Belfast a quarter of a century ago, we'd never have had a Good Friday Agreement, because everybody would have simply said it's impossible. Is there a way of resolving it? Well, yes. If we can find a way of getting the leadership in the British government and the Irish government to engage with each other and not have Brussels saying we represent Ireland, because they don't, they represent Brussels, and that's a totally different thing. And people who talk about wanting to maintain the Good Friday Agreement need to understand it's not all about North-South array. It's about relationships between Unionists and Nationalists and others within Northern Ireland. It is about North-South, but it is also about East-West. And all of those elements have to be involved in the negotiations, and all of them have to be involved in finding a resolution to the problems which the protocol addressed but has not resolved. So to me, that's the way forward, recognizing it's about relationships, enabling people to engage with each other, not having people who say, we're defending the Good Friday Agreement, when they're only interested in defending the strand of the Good Friday Agreement that they favor, and the propositions and the people that they support, but rather to recognize all three strands and the external relationships are important and must be understood in that way. If we can do that, we can find a way through this. It won't be a permanent outcome, because of course the relationships aren't. They will change and develop. And indeed, Brexit itself may well have begun to set in train, or if not that, then to accelerate some changes in identity on the island of Ireland. That may well be the case. We don't know for sure. May well be the case. Certainly if Scotland became independent, that would be another major change in development. And for me, I'm not hopeless about it at all. Things have been a lot more hopeless than this, and we found a way through. And if we can pay enough attention, I think we can find a way through again.
Thank you, John. That's great. We'll come back to you on a little bit about how to get to that point. But first, let me hand over to Jonathan and get his take, having listened to what John has to say.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Ben, for inviting me to participate and to reciprocate what John said. It's always a pleasure to do anything with John. We worked together for 30 odd years doing very similar things. And I have huge respect for the courage he showed as alliance leader during that difficult time and the contribution he made as speaker and as a negotiator. So it's really a great pleasure to be with him. And I agree with everything he said, and I want to just try and build a little bit on what he said in the context of the protocol. First thing I think is you have to bear in mind that Northern Ireland was always the insoluble problem of Brexit. It was pointed out before Brexit happened that if we left the customs union, if we left the single market, there had to be a border somewhere. The border could be on the island of Ireland between North and South, could be in the Irish Sea, but there had to be a border. Theresa May tried a Heath Robinson type of solution of the whole of the UK remaining in the customs union to see if she could find a way around it like that. And it failed, and Boris Johnson came in and decided that the border would be in the Irish Sea. And this raises two sorts of problems. The first is a problem of identity, and it's important to distinguish between these two different sorts of problems. The first problem that the protocol raises, and any agreement on Brexit would have raised, is this issue of identity. If you put the border in the Irish Sea, you are indeed affecting unionists who want to be part of the United Kingdom, And if they face a border, that is a problem. Had you put the border on the island of Ireland, that would have raised a problem for nationalists and Republicans because it would have cut them off from the rest of Ireland. So there was an identity problem. But what we then faced in the beginning of this year is the beginning of last year was the practical problems that came from the protocol itself, trying to implement it, stopping pot plants and medicine and other things, sausages, getting to Northern Ireland. But those two problems have become entangled, and trying to solve them, we need to think about them as two different sorts of problems. Now, the EU has tried to resolve the first problem, the practical problem, by introducing a series of measures to ameliorate the checks at the border, try and smooth things out, to make sure that medicines can get through and so on. The approach adopted by the British negotiators, David Frost in particular, was, on the contrary, completely ideological. Instead of trying to work for practical solutions, he raised issues like the ECJ, which frankly had absolutely nothing to do with the practical problems and very little, if anything, to do with the identity problems of unionists. The tactics he engaged in the negotiations, as John said, would stop anyone negotiating anything, to try and confront people rather than actually trying to make progress. So it is welcome that Liz Truss, in coming in, has tried to lower the temperature, tried to focus on the practical chances of a solution, risking the ERG's ire when it comes to her leadership pretensions when Boris Johnson goes and she tries to take over. So I think she deserves credit for that. Today, they seem to have ended with not a breakthrough nor a breakdown. They say they're going to go subterranean during the election period in Northern Ireland while they're negotiating. I think that's a sensible thing to do. I think they can get to some sort of outcome on customs, although there will be problems. The problem, I think, lies in SPS. It's these agricultural issues where I think they're really going to struggle to find a way through unless the British government can actually embrace EU SPS rules, those are the rules relating to agricultural products and so on. It ought to be able to do so because Joe Biden came here at the G7 summit and made it clear that he would not let any provisions the UK agreed in the context of this stand in the way of a trade agreement with the US, which was the excuse used by the government for saying they couldn't accept EU SPS rules, the only reason they had for doing it, but they're still not prepared to accept that. So that SPS problem is really going to be the nub of the practical issue that we have to try and deal with. But we have to bear in mind that this is only solving the practical problems. It will not solve the identity problem. The problem with the identity issue is that there really is no alternative to the protocol that anyone has come up with. For about 5 years, we had the Brexiteers saying there were technological answers. We could abolish borders around the world by introducing technology. But as the EU negotiators had to point out to David Frost, you can't actually identify individual cows by satellite as they try and cross a border. There are no technological answers to these problems. Now we have the nonsense of mutual enforcement that Ian Duncan Smith is trying to advance as the solution. The fact is you have to have a border. That's why countries have borders. We choose where it is. It will be far worse on land because it will be right in your face. At least on sea, no one actually gets to see it apart from those driving lorries over with products. The danger this has posed to the Good Friday Agreement, which John and I and many others spent a good part of our life trying to introduce and then actually get to work in practice, is not, I think, a return to the Troubles. It's not about taking us back to 30 years of civil war. But what it is going to do, and what it has done, is created a political crisis. The problem is that Boris Johnson and David Frost marched Jeffrey Donaldson to the top of the hill. They got him to say he was rejecting the protocol, he wasn't going to accept the protocol. And now he's got a problem of how he gets down that hill again, because clearly, as I said, there is no alternative to the protocol that anyone has come up with yet. If the Unionists were to propose the border should be on the island of Ireland, it would be a real problem. And they haven't so far, apart from occasionally Sammy Wilson, suggested that's what should happen. So you're not going to find an alternative solution. So how does the DUP climb down? And it's all the more difficult for them to climb down when they're being looked at by the TUV, who are going to be attacking them whatever happens. If they try and declare success when Liz Truss manages to negotiate some practical provisions to make the border less in your face, that is not going to be good enough for the TUV. And the DUP is terrified of losing votes to its right. It always tacks to the right if it's under threat rather than to the centre. So I don't see quite how Jeffrey Donaldson gets off this kick as we now go into the elections. And then once we come through the elections, where you may well end up with a Sinn Féin First Minister, it's going to make it even more difficult for the DUP to get those institutions up and running again. And of course, Sinn Féin don't have that much interest in getting the institutions up and running, and certainly not unless they get the things they've been demanding, like the Irish language. So what Boris Johnson and this approach to Brexit and has marched us into is a political crisis in Northern Ireland that will make it very difficult to get the institutions up again. And the whole point of the Good Friday Agreement was to try and get away from the issues of identity being the only source of politics in Northern Ireland, what John has been doing his whole life, to try and get politics to be about real things like education, about health, about spending, and all those sort of things. What Brexit has done, what the government's approach to the protocol negotiations has done, is make identity the issue again. That has raised, understandably, the unionist neurosis about a united Ireland. They can see what's happening in terms of demography. They know what will be in the census later this year when it comes out. They know there will be more, in all probability, more Catholics than Protestants, although thank goodness that third category of neither has increased enormously. But that they know that's going to happen. They know that Brexit has reduced the number of Catholics who will keep voting for a united Ireland. That does not mean the united Ireland is imminent, but it means this neurosis about it is affecting everything that we do. And John, as a psychological expert, will know that if we don't talk about something, that doesn't make it go away. So the fact the Irish government won't talk about it, the British government won't talk about it, unionists won't talk about it, only people who want to talk about it are Sinn Féin, and that's pretty obvious why they want it. But unless we actually have a proper discussion, that neurosis will continue and will make this identity issue so much worse. So there is a solution, as John says, but it's a solution to the practical problems, to making this worse, making this work, not worse, and get us back to where we were with the Good Friday Agreement, where identity was there, something we can talk about, something we're going to settle peacefully. There's a wild card in all this. Let me just end by saying that. There's a wild card, of course. We have Ian Duncan Smith again in the papers saying we must reject the protocol over the weekend, urging Boris Johnson to do so. We had the ERG and the Telegraph saying they're going to bring Johnson down if he doesn't trigger Article 16. And one can imagine circumstances in which Boris Johnson gets so desperate, he reaches for Article 16 as the only way of saving himself from the Metropolitan Police. I hope he won't do that. We have every reason to try and stay united as Europe at the moment in the face of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, but you can't rule out that thing. And that really will tip us into serious trouble in Northern Ireland and a trade war with the EU. So I hope he doesn't do it. There is a solution, but I'm not convinced this government will get us that. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Interesting. So, John, you talked a lot about relationships, and Jonathan started his intervention laying out all the rule-based and practical problems, which are not going to go away. As an outside observer, it seems to me that much of the talk, or much of the talk in the press anyway, has actually been about the rules issues and the institutional issues, and the institutions on both sides of this, the EU on one side, the British government on the other, being maybe over obsessed with their own rules and their own ways of doing it. So how do we move on from this rules-based discussion to what you suggested has to happen as a relationship-based discussion, and then the rules kind of take a back seat? Is that possible?
I think in many ways, as ever, Jonathan pointed us in the right direction. And when he teased out this important difference between the problems of identity and the practical legal difficulties. If I take the practical legal difficulties for a moment, if it's possible to involve all those who are relevant to the discussions, there are ways of getting through some of the practical difficulties. For example, quite some time ago, when I was asked by the Seanad, the upper chamber of the Parliament in Dublin, to come and talk with them about it quite a long time ago, I pointed out that actually there were only a relatively few issues that were really major north-south import-export issues. One of them was energy, and the other was agriculture and agricultural products. Those are the biggies. And actually, it would be possible, you know, to address some of those practical problems. You'll remember famously that Dr. Paisley, when he was asked how he as an anti-European was able to support farmers in Northern Ireland applying for European grants, he famously said, "Ah, well, you see, the people are British, but the cows are Irish." And so the point is that many people in the unionist community have long accepted that the island of Ireland is, from an agricultural point of view, a quarantine area that you need to keep safe. You can't deal with foot and mouth disease if, for example, you don't deal with the island as a whole and separate from the other larger island. So I think it's not a question of whether all the issues are dealt with in one basket that has to be resolved. I think from a practical point of view, on these questions, there are ways of addressing them because of the unique geographical position of Ireland as a whole, separate from both the mainland of Europe and from Great Britain as an island. The other, and Jonathan in a sense pointed us to the fact that, you know, if people are serious, those practical things can be addressed if there's any kind of flexibility at all. Any kind of smuggling, if anybody thinks that smuggling is going to disappear anytime, it was there before the European Union, it was there before Britain, and it'll be there after the European Union. It's part of the culture of the island. It's not going to go away. It's going to be negligible in comparison with the smuggling that goes on in the rest of Europe. If that wasn't the case, as you pointed out in your article in El País, why would we be getting so much cocaine finding its way into the European Union? So you're not going to seal these borders. But the more difficult question that Jonathan points up is the identity one. And that's the one about relationships. Well, let me inject in just one point which I think is important and could turn out to be very relevant, and that's this. The loyalty and the sense of relationship of unionists in the north is to Scotland, not to England. There's no particular love for England at all, or English people for that matter. But Scotland is quite different. That's where Presbyterianism came to Ireland. It disappeared in England and largely in Wales, but it is the dominant approach culturally in Scotland and in the north of Ireland. So any British government that was thoughtful about these, any Irish government that was thoughtful would be saying, well, let's try to explore the relationship with Scotland. And of course, as I said earlier on, if Scotland decided to go independent, that completely changes the whole picture as far as unionists are concerned. So why are they loyal to the Queen? Well, the Queen, as it happens, wears two crowns. She wears the Scottish crown as well as the English crown. And when she crosses the border to Scotland, she's no longer the head of the church, because that's not the head of the church in Scotland. These are complexities of history that many people are quite illiterate about, but they still inform how people feel deep inside themselves. Is it impossible to think of a way in which unionists might have a different and more open relationship with the South? Absolutely. Don't forget the interview that was done first with Arlene Foster and then with Ian Paisley's widow, Eileen. Whenever Arlene was asked what would happen if Sinn Féin became a majority and there was a united Ireland, she said, I'd leave. When Eileen was asked, she said, this is my country. I'll stay here. Things have changed. As long as there's no persecution of me as a Protestant, I will be staying in Ireland. What I think that tells you is not that there's some easy solution, but that if we separate the two issues as Jonathan has done, and if we deal with them in ways that are appropriate to the kind of problem they are, they're not as insoluble as we think. And if we deal with the practicalities and then take time over the identity ones, all sorts of positive things may well happen that we didn't quite expect.
Thank you, John. Jonathan, one of the comments that John made earlier was the role of the Irish government and whether the Irish government sees itself as being a bridge or whether it sees itself as being Brussels representative, if you like. What's your view on that in terms of the atmosphere that that has created?
Well, I don't actually have any complaints about the way the Irish government has acted on all this. I think John's right. There's been a slight confusion of what it's trying to do. Is it defending European interests? Is it defending Irish interests? Where is it defending Irish interests in Brussels? Is it so that does become complicated for them, and it's complicated because many of the other European countries have different views. So France, for example, has really quite strong views about products coming from Britain into Northern Ireland and across the sea into France, understandably, because the ferry routes all go from the south into France, whereas Germany and other countries are far more relaxed. So Ireland has been trying to bicycle very hard, covering both sides. But I think that the antagonistic language used by the ERG and by people in Boris Johnson's government about Ireland is really unfortunate. We've actually set back Anglo-Irish relations by, I don't know, a couple of decades, well, more than a couple of decades now, probably 3 decades. People forget how bad relations between British and Irish governments used to be until at least John Major, and really actually it was only Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern who put them really on a very firm footing, and that led to the Queen's visit and all the other things. They've put us back by the way they've slagged off the Irish government, which is trying to do its best. You know, they came up with an answer which they gave to Boris Johnson up in Liverpool, which he adopted. They tried to find solutions that I think would work for both sides, and they've been pretty churlishly treated by the British government in response to that. They, of course, are the ones who will suffer most if this all goes horribly wrong. You know, if someone triggers Article 16, then they are the ones who will pay the highest price for it. And already their economy is having to adjust really quite rapidly with the vast increase of ferries going directly to France, less traffic coming through the UK because of the complications. So I don't think I have many, if any, complaints about the Irish government. I think they've tried their best. I have quite substantial complaints about what the current British government has done to set back Anglo-Irish relations, which I hope can be picked up again quite quickly by a new and more congenial government.
Thank you. I'll just start to pick some questions out from the audience, if I may. Audrey Eager asks that it is the language in the Northern Ireland Protocol that is important as it relates to the constitutional issue of the Union. So Bertie Ahern's argument apparently is that the Northern Ireland Protocol is a question of trade, not constitutionality. And if the focus was placed on downgrading the language to a purely trade language, would that take the heat out, or has that ship already sailed? John.
I think to some extent that ship has sailed, or horse has bolted, or whatever analogy you like to use. And I think it's important to understand that this hasn't been a simple, constant thing. As Jonathan was mentioning, there have been very unhappy and unfortunate things have happened. But if we go back to Theresa May, for example, even before she was Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary, she started introducing legislation to address the borders of the United Kingdom. And I remember asking the minister in the Lords who was dealing with this, well, have you been in touch with the Minister of Justice in the Republic? And he said, no. And I said, well, the only land border that you have and that you're trying to police is the one between North and South in Ireland. Why have you not been in touch with them? And he said, well, we never thought about it. And you see, I think that's part of the problem. English politicians in particular just don't think about the things. They're not necessarily trying to be nasty or snub people, but they don't think about it. And that's been going on for a long time. And that annoys Irish people to be told that they're really not terribly important and that they don't bother thinking about them. So there's that atmosphere, first of all, right? Then you get the fallout over Brexit. And the result of that was that Leo Varadkar, when he was Taoiseach, made clear that he was going to be standing with Brussels, and that people had to accommodate themselves to that in Britain. Now, as time went on, unfortunately, the British government became more truculent and difficult, as Jonathan has described, not just in relation to Ireland, but in relation to their own party and the rest of the country and all sorts of things. It was an attitudinal problem, which we suffer from. In Ireland, we moved to a Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, who actually, despite the party he was leading, which you might have thought would have been more nationalistic than Fine Gael, that was led by Leo Varadkar, Micheál Martin actually was much more accommodating and emollient. He realized the issues, and he started to try to say and do things that were more open. Now, had he been faced with a British government that understood the complexities of the situation as previous governments did, I think they would have grasped that with both hands and said, yes, let's sit down and see where we can get together because we understand each other. But instead of that, it really wasn't received with as much sensitivity and understanding. And so it hasn't been able to go forward yet. But I think it is still entirely possible that people, perhaps after the elections in May, both the local government elections in England and the assembly elections in Northern Ireland, and people reflect on the outcome of those elections, whatever it happens to be, then I think that may be a very important opportunity to recalibrate the approach to the protocol and find a way forward in conjunction with colleagues in Brussels.
Thanks, John. A question for you, Jonathan. So one of the proposals from the British government, as I understand it, unless I've got this wrong, is to remove any kind of checks of mainland goods going to Northern Ireland, which are destined for Northern Ireland, but not for goods that are destined to cross the border. Now, we all know, as John has made it clear, that leakage, let's put it that way, will happen, but hardly enough to destroy the European single market. So what are the reasonable objections to that kind of practical, though technocratically imperfect solution?
Well, I think the objection is the way this will change over time. Presumably, the point of Brexit is that we diverge from EU rules and have more and more rules of our own that are different from the EU. So if you're France and you really don't want to have chlorinated chicken, and if we really are going to sign an agricultural agreement with the United States that gives us chlorinated chicken, you might start with 1 or 2 chlorinated chickens going to Sainsbury's in Belfast, or Marks and Sparks if they're still trading by then in Belfast. But you might then find truckloads. And the French have been monitoring very carefully these very large increases in flow of trucks from Ireland into France. And they worry that they could really face quite significant smuggling of that sort. So it's all very well for Brexiteers to say, oh, it's fine, we can just say these things are staying in Northern Ireland, and we can just make companies swear that they're going to stay in Northern Ireland. But companies may not have control over these things once they've left the UK and gone in a truck into Ireland, unless you then introduce a border between North and South to stop those trucks crossing the border. So I think the EU, I mean, I'm sure the EU is too bureaucratic on many of these things, and I'm sure the British actually are as well for different reasons. But I think just saying we can leave it to hope, particularly given what John was saying about smuggling. Smuggling in Northern Ireland has been a very lucrative pastime for a very long. People like Slab Murphy have made a very great deal of money out of it. They see a chance of smuggling chickens as opposed to diesel, they'll be onto it. So I think that the Europeans really have quite a good case for why they have to have, they're not asking for watertight rules, but rules that at least can be enforced if you suddenly see a surge in some of these things.
Yeah, but is the volume really going to be enough to be worrying? That's the question, I guess. I mean, considering, as John said,
because it's not going to be, because how would you control the volume at that stage? You're going to suddenly say, if you're not checking it, how do you know the volume has suddenly gone up and all those chickens are going across and not ending up on a ferry to Roscoff?
Good point.
Could I just say, Joe, I think that Jonathan is, of course, absolutely right. But what that means is that you might have to look at the question of checking between the Republic of Ireland and France, maybe more than between there and Germany and so on. So there is no cost-free way for any of us here if we want peace.
Right.
And of course, European bureaucrats would say, but we've got a free market here. Well, you have, really stopping it going, just checking whether or not it fulfills the requirements. And of course, it wouldn't be that difficult, I think, in any way, technically or otherwise, but it would be difficult politically if there were checks on chlorinated chicken going from Rosslare to Le Havre, for example. But that's the kind of negotiation, I think, that is, we could see that being possible if it didn't have to be entirely bureaucratic.
Yes. But it seems that it's very hard to get the bureaucratic to take a back seat. I don't know what both your views are on that.
I think it is if you're dealing with Northern Europe. If you're dealing with Southern Europe, they just say yes, 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 and go on and do whatever they wanted to do for years. I don't think people in Brussels are often very realistic about what happens in the southern part of Europe. And that's, of course, causing all sorts of problems. It's also true of the eastern part of Europe. And it's causing all sorts of problems in the relationship with the eastern part of Europe as well. So maybe if it was possible to look at Ireland not just as a problem in the West, but as an example of the kind of problem that already exists in other parts of North to South Europe and East to West Europe, there might be a few important lessons learned about how to manage other difficulties in the rest of Europe.
What's your view on that?
To be fair to the EU, they have tried to actually reduce checks substantially from what was originally agreed. You know, they had an agreement with the British government who signed up to all of these things in the first place. They've now agreed unilaterally on their side to get rid of as many of them as they think they can. I'm sure the more they can get rid of, I'm sure a sensible negotiation, not insulting them, not saying you're going to pull Article 16 at any moment, could get rid of more of them. But they're going to have some checks, because there has to be a border. Why are we going to have checks with Europe? Because we're going to have a border. Why are the checks at Dover? Why is there a queue? When I came back on the Eurostar from Brussels on Friday, that lorry queue goes right up a long way to London. Why is that there? Because of the checks. Checks are there because of Brexit. That's the problem.
So John Peach from The Economist rightly points out that triggering Article 16 would not solve anything. It would just get us back to a more not quite a blank sheet of paper, but a very acrimonious blank sheet of paper. And we'd have to start again. And it's not going to find a solution suddenly. So John, what do you think the thinking of the British government is about waiving this threat of triggering Article 16, seeing as it doesn't really solve anything?
I think the problem is the word that you use, thinking. I don't think there's a lot of thinking going on. I think there's a lot of emotional reaction going on, and people looking to see, how can I get through today's problem or today's difficulty in the press or whatever. What would be really valuable would be if we could get some calm, thoughtful engagement in the British government and with others as well. And as we're running up to elections, that's always a difficult time. And of course, there's important elections in France, which are not entirely irrelevant to all of this as well. So I don't think we're going to get any of these issues resolved insofar as they can be in the next 2 or 3 months. But I think when we get the other side of May, not just because of elections in Britain and in Northern Ireland, but also in France, that it may well be possible on the outcome of those to have more thought and more calm engagement, and that it might be possible to do something at that point, as long as people are open to it. But I don't think it's at all impossible. I just think there are times when it's difficult to get people to think about things, and there are some politicians and parties that aren't really very good at thinking, but are very successful because they appeal to people's feelings.
Jonathan, there's a question here from Maggie Byrne. You mentioned on the identity issues, you mentioned that the DUP has been marched up the hill and is going to be very difficult for it to find a respectable way down. What do you think are the options to help it find a respectable way down?
Well, I wouldn't have started from here, as I'll say if you were in Ireland, but I think that David Frost, in particular, and Boris Johnson did it for political reasons. It's not the first time they've marched the UP up the hill. I mean, they did it with Arlene Foster. That's why she lost her job. And now they've done it to Jeffrey Donaldson. I'm pretty much certain that Jeffrey Donaldson would like to claim a triumph if there's any sort of agreement with the EU that removes the practical problems or reduces the practical problems sufficiently. I'm pretty sure that's what he would like to do. The problem he's got is this political problem, the TUV and probably the UUP, although see if they're going to be responsible or not, I wouldn't count on it, in the pursuit of unionist votes. And then we have this splintering of unionist votes that looks like it's going to happen in the May elections unless the DUP can somehow corral all the unionist votes to stop Sinn Féin getting the first minister slot. And if they get the first minister slot, and it's going to be very difficult for Jeffrey Donaldson to persuade his party to go back into the institutions. And then where does that leave us? Because Sinn Féin aren't in a rush to go back into these institutions. We can't carry on governing with just civil service government indefinitely. Someone has to do a budget, has to make decisions about things. If we go back to direct rule, that's going to provoke a whole problem with the Irish government, nationalists and Republicans. So they're taking us into a blasted cul-de-sac with this thing politically. And I don't very easily see the way out. The best hope I have is that Jeffrey will tough it out. We'll say, yes, we've got a deal. Let's resolve the practical problems. We've got the best of both worlds. Let's go with this, and just takes a risk with the TUV and the UUP and comes through. But even if he does that, if you have Sinn Féin as the first minister in the north, as possibly the largest party in the south fairly soon, then unionists have got a really big problem. This takes me back to the point I was making, that it's all very well us not talking about United Ireland, and I don't think United Ireland is imminent. But when Tony Blair went in 1997 to Balmoral Agricultural Fair outside Belfast, he said he didn't expect there to be a United Ireland in his lifetime. I totally agreed with him. I'm now not so sure about that. And I think if we don't talk about how do you defend the interests of a very large group of Protestants who do not want to be in a united Ireland? How do you deal with the desire to have their own local government in a united Irish? If we don't actually start talking about some of these issues, this problem is going to get worse and worse, and we'll just end up with a deadlock on the institutions, unable to get them back. We'll have to go to direct rule again, and then we'll be back almost where we're not back to where we started in terms of violence, but back to where we started politically, and the issue of identity front and center again, which is really not what we want.
John, this issue of this issue of the United Ireland, the spectre of a United Ireland raises its head, of course, for the Unionists in Northern Ireland. Do we think that a united Ireland is something that the Irish population, the Southern Irish population, actually want?
I remember in one of the periods of talks, a senior Irish negotiator came to me and said, John, I've just been thinking, you know, if we had a united Ireland, somebody in the DUP, and he mentioned a particular name, which I'll not mention, said it could, for example, be, you know, the Minister of Agriculture or something like that. And I said, well, yes, of course. And he said, I'm going off the notion. And the whole point was he realized that you would be importing into his state a whole set of difficulties when it took 2 or 3 generations to get out of the difficulties after the War of Independence. So there's a lot of people in politics in the South who waken up with the cold sweats if they're in government at the thought that a British Prime Minister might turn around and say to them, well, fair enough, I have no objection, have them. Because you're importing a huge set of problems. And for example, would you need a new constitution for your country, a new flag, a new anthem, a whole new set of institutions? I was talking recently to somebody who knew many years pre the wall coming down in East Germany as it was then. And I was talking to him about, he's very angry about what happened when Germany came together. Why? Because the West just absorbed the East. They didn't sit down and negotiate a new constitution or a whole new set of institutions that understood that people in the East had become different over the years because they'd lived a different life. So if there was to be United Ireland, it wouldn't be an absorption of the North by the South. It would be a whole new set of structures and institutions in a country that has had all the political difficulties, and indeed in more recent times had many difficulties over the role of the church and what has happened to church and religion in the Republic of Ireland, some of which has made it a problem for some people in the South, and some of it has made it easier for some people in the North. And also there's been a change. We talk about unionists and nationalists, but as Jonathan pointed out, there's now a whole cohort of people who are much more metropolitan in their attitudes in Northern Ireland. And if they discovered that in the medium term, not even the long term, the medium term, that some of the interests that they have, whether that's being pro-EU or whether it's economic and social interests, that actually being more close to the South would be in their interest, there's an increasing number of them that would say, well, actually, you know, I don't really feel the same kind of sense of relationship with England and with London, and we're closer and we can get on better with people in the South. So, you know, this is a movable feast. This is not the laws of the Medes and Persians. This is relationships in these islands. And I think there's a very real possibility that they change and develop. And I can hear it even in talking with people, the kind of attitudes that they have. And I don't think we should either despair of it or feel that it is hopeless. I think there are things that can be done to enable people to engage with each other. And there are many people in the South who would be very worried about a united Ireland coming too quickly. And as I say, what about this relationship between the North and Scotland as well? That's something that needs a bit more exploration. Not very long ago, one of the Archbishop of Canterbury's representatives brought a number of loyalists to London and got a bit of criticism for it. But one of the things that he did was he said to some of these loyalists from Northern Ireland, look down the Thames there. What kind of range of people live there now? How much would you identify with the multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious society that is England now? Not England 100 years ago, but England now. And you know, they found themselves really puzzled as they began to think about the consequences of the changes that have taken place in England for their relationship with England, and the changes that have taken place in the Republic of Ireland in terms of the relationships. That's the kind of exploration that's really important, and is the meat and drink of the identity question that Jonathan pointed up, is probably the more complex one, but by no means insoluble either.
So, Jonathan, we've got the bigger problems brewing in Ukraine about membership of NATO, and the discussion has turned a little bit at the moment that while we can keep saying that the Ukraine may join NATO, it's a distant dream and we shouldn't really worry about it. Do you think that something similar could be framed around the idea of a united Ireland? And would that help? And did those sorts of discussions come up when you were negotiating for the Good Friday Agreement?
I don't recall those arguments coming up in the actual negotiations on Good Friday Agreement or its implementation. But I do think that the same core issue is at stake in both places, and that's the issue of consent. In the case of Ukraine, the issue is, do the people of Ukraine want to join NATO or not? It's not up to us. We can say they can't join if they try and join us, but if they want to join, are we the ones to tell them they can't? That's the fundamental question. And no, we can't, because they're a sovereign state and they should decide their own future. And this was the point about Northern Ireland. That's why I think you can't really say, you may want to join United Ireland, but you can't do it for 20 years. That would just be a recipe for getting back into conflict. So I think we had to say that there would be a border poll if the Secretary of State thought there was grounds for thinking there's a majority of people who want a united Ireland. The problem comes, as always, that if you get a 52-48% split in that vote, then what do you do with the 48% who don't want to join the Republic of Ireland? It's quite possible lots of people in the South will have cold feet about a united Ireland, but there's not much they can do about it because they've always wanted a united Ireland. They can't really back off that. And interestingly, polls still show an overwhelming majority in the South, when asked the question, say they want a united Ireland, even though, as John said, they haven't thought through the consequences for themselves in terms of money and elsewhere. So I don't think you can put a time limit on this. I don't think you can have a moratorium. In the end, if the people want it, you're going to have to provide it, but you're going to have to, that's why you have to ask these questions. What do you do to protect their rights? Can you have some form of condominium that could be negotiated? And just a straight referendum isn't going to answer these questions. It's a bit like a referendum on Scotland. You have a referendum, but what are you going to do about the border if Scotland rejoins the EU and we're not in the EU? The border problem in Northern Ireland will look like child's play by comparison with that border. So I think this is my point, that we need to start talking about these issues, demystifying them, and sort of pointing out some of the difficulties in this that need to be discussed. I think that's far more productive than trying to impose a time limit, say you can't have it for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever time you would choose.
Very good. There's a comment here from David Waddell, which says, picking up on the Irish discomfort in unfolding in the north, I know that governing politicians in Dublin are much more reluctant to tolerate Sinn Féin in government in Ireland than they are to tolerate them in Northern Ireland. What's your view on that, John?
Well, it's not only a question of tolerating it in Northern Ireland, they actually push for them to be involved in government in Northern Ireland and praise unionists when they go into government with them. But the last thing they're prepared to do is actually go into government with Sinn Féin in the Republic of Ireland. And there are various reasons for that. It's not all just to do with the violence. There are quite fundamental political differences in the kind of society that they want to construct. And here's a place where I think that organizations like Radix and others can play a rather important role, because what Jonathan has pointed out is there is whole complexity. If you talk about a united Ireland, what do you do about all sorts of differences between North and South? Health service differences, pension differences, economic differences, educational differences, all sorts of differences. Recently, well, I say recently, it was actually about 18 months or more ago, Sinn Féin produced a document on the economic benefits of united Ireland. And they sent, a couple of them sent me a copy of the document, two of their leading people, and I read it, and it was terrible. Didn't make any, it was completely economically illiterate, and some of it was just nonsensical. And it was, I even remember, well, I'll not say what his name was, but a leading member of SDLP, when I talked about the economic problems of United Ireland, he said, oh, the Brits will pay for the next 25 years. And I said, you got to be kidding. once they get rid of the problem, the last thing they're going to do is continue to pay for it. Oh, the guilt will make them do it. I said, you don't know them the way I know them. They'll be gone in 6 months. So the point is that if organizations like Radix and others can enable people to start having serious conversations about what if, it'll not be easy to get people engaged, because although Southern and Republican and nationalist politicians will engage, most unionists don't want to talk about it. However, there are some, particularly those no longer active politics. Peter Robinson, for example, talked about how unionists needed to address the question in order to refute it. Fair enough, but they need to address the question. And so I think there is a possibility, serious possibility, of engaging people in it, as long as you make clear that that engagement is not to persuade them of a united Ireland, but to address the complexities that others are taking for granted can easily be done. And then I think you create a whole new dynamic. Conversation, when it can be created, can be extremely powerful in addressing some of these questions. And so that's, I mean, it's one of many reasons why I'm very happy to participate in this conversation that Radix has put together. But I think there are others who maybe less easily relate with each other than Jonathan and I, but who could actually, to some extent, have more of an impact because they're so far apart now, and conversation could help to take them forward.
So to that point, Jonathan, I mean, is this not a recurring issue? You know, Brexit was going to be the easiest thing in the world. Scottish independence is going to be the easiest thing in the world for those who want it. United Ireland is going to be the easiest thing in the world for those who want it. Is this not a kind of almost in an inevitable pattern?
Well, it is. It's from the man who told us the border in Northern Ireland and the Republic was the same as the border between Islington and Camden for the congestion charge. Unfortunately not. It's slightly more complicated. And as is discovered with Brexit, it's slightly more complicated. And the trouble is that, I mean, thank God he'll soon be off our hands and we're going to face a more serious government at some stage. And that government's then going to have to wrestle with these serious issues because obviously Brexit remains, but someone's going to have to make Brexit work in practice. And we've seen the economic damage that it's done. We've seen the difficulties in terms of logistics and so on, which we've begun to see it. We've seen the difficulties being created in Northern Ireland, and there needs to be some government that could take these things on. Now, at the moment, in Number 10, they're not interested in Northern Ireland. There's a John Bew, who's an excellent guy, but he comes from a particular tradition who can't really provide the thinking or the action on Northern Ireland in the way that previous governments have done. And we've had a series of very weak Northern Ireland secretaries. I mean, the notable exception of Julian Smith, who was excellent. But in that case, then who is actually going to be doing any thinking for the British government on these issues? It certainly wasn't David Frost. So someone needs to actually grip this issue, start thinking about the consequences, and trying to find a way through. Because as John said at the beginning of this, there is a way through, but it's only going to be done with someone who's got good faith, good intellect, and actually has the confidence of people in Northern Ireland. And one of the most remarkable things this government has done is destroy the acceptance of the British government in Northern Ireland. Traditionally, you'd be on religious grounds, you'd end up with sort of 60% of the people saying the British government was doing a good job or whatever it is relative to Northern Ireland. Now you've got nearly 80% of people who don't trust the British government for understandable reasons. That is a real crisis. We're going to rule by direct rule. You've got 80% of the population who don't trust you. That is not a very happy recipe for consent or for sorting out some of these problems.
Thanks very much. Well, that was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much both for sharing your insights and expertise and experience. We couldn't have had a better couple, as it were, to to talk to us about these issues. And I've certainly ended up with, I guess, a lot more hope than I started. So that's certainly from me getting to bed tonight. It's a positive thing. Thank you again, and I'll hand over to Ben to close the session.
So can I just add my thanks? That was incredibly incisive, depressing in places, but at least I feel that we've been given a clear message, which is a mission, which is to address the complexities of the situation we're in. And we'd be delighted to hear from anyone on this call who would like to be part of that. Can I just say, quick advert We have 3 further events planned, and we'd very much like your company at them. On the 3rd of March, we are hosting Sir Ed Davey, who will be launching the book that he's just edited on the battle for liberal Britain. And that's at 3 o'clock. If you haven't received an invitation for that, please let us, please get in touch. We'd be delighted to see anybody here for that. And then our first live event for some time is the launch of Joe Zemek-Lucia's new book, New Political Capitalism, which I shall riskily attempt to summarize in front of the author, which is focusing on the role of business in trying to, whether it's still a possible option for business to say politics is somebody else's problem. And Joe will be taking us through his book and no doubt signing copies, or you'll be able to pick up rare unsigned copies. Finally, on the 10th and 11th of June, we have our flagship event, the Big Tent Festival and Summit in Bristol, and tickets will be available for that very shortly, and we very much hope people will come and join us for a full day and a half of discussions there. Very lastly, just to say, we do all of this as a charity. We think that the conversations that you have taken part have helped you to form your opinions and to engage with politics. If you think that that is worth the cost of a ticket to the theatre, which you can do again, or a pint in the pub, then please become a friend of Radix Big Tent. We're posting, no doubt, in the chat the way in which you can do that. We will also circulate it afterwards, but please do support us to be able to continue these discussions. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, John. Thank you, Joe, for what was a really superb discussion, and see you all very soon on the 3rd of March.